Welcome to one of my favorite topics, Arthurian literature. The tales of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table have been circulating orally and on vellum and paper for many centuries. The real Arthur, if there was one, probably lived during that murky period in Britain after the Roman army pulled out and before the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes gained power over the majority of the island. Stories about the mythic Arthur circulated in one of those Celtic fringe areas we discussed in the early medieval lecture, Wales, where they mixed with Irish stories like those about the superhero Cuchulainn. There's a story about Cuchulainn, by the way, in Volume A of our anthology, if you're interested in him. When I was an undergraduate English major at the University of Texas at Austin, I spent a summer at Oxford University studying Arthurian literature. It was one of the most amazing experiences of my life, and one that had a profound impact. As a class, we visited many of the sites associated with the historic and the literary Arthur. Tintagel in Cornwall, where he was supposedly conceived, Cadbury Castle in Somerset, site of an Iron Age hill fort linked with Camelot, and Glastonbury, which some scholars think is the Isle of Avalon. In 2019, while accompanying my parents on their 50th anniversary trip, we traveled around the Celtic fringes, so to speak, in Scotland, northern England, and Wales, and my son and I climbed Arthur's Seat, an extinct volcano overlooking the city of Edinburgh, which you can see off in the distance in this picture. Many places around Great Britain have Arthurian associations. I have several books at home about finding the real King Arthur, and many modern and older adaptations of the King Arthur story. But I don't want to bore those uninterested in the archaeology or historical basis of these tales. The literature itself is interesting enough. I don't have a TV series or film recommendation for this topic, but I'll put book recommendations at the end of the lecture notes if you find yourself intrigued by this topic. Now, back to literature. The 12th century French author Jean Bodel, who lived between 1165 and 1210, famously wrote "Non sont que trois matières à nous on entend, de France et de Bretagne et de Rome la Grande," which is medieval French for "There are only three topics or matters of romance, the matters of France, the matter of Britain, and the matter of Rome." The matter of France concerns Charlemagne and his court, and is where we get the epic Song of Roland. The matter of Rome consisted of adaptations of Virgil's Aeneid and tales of the quote-unquote knights who fled Troy after its defeat in the Trojan War and founded Rome. And the matter of Britain? That's King Arthur and his knights. The matter of Britain comprised three lines: a Celtic Norman English line, a French line, and a German line. We'll mainly concern ourselves with the Celtic Norman English line, but I'll mention a few of the major French and German texts later in this lecture. All this to say that there was a European-wide interest in the matter of Britain, with Arthurian tales circulating in English, Welsh, French, German, and even Norwegian. I'd like to talk now about historical or quasi-historical sources. We met the Venerable Bede, who wrote the history of Christianity in England in the late Roman and early medieval England period briefly in the last set of lectures. Gildas was a 6th century monk who wrote De Excidio et Conquesto Britanniae, which details the history of Britain after the Roman army leaves, in a series of sermons that condemns his contemporaries, both secular and religious. Gildas does not mention Arthur specifically, but he does bring up a leader he calls Ambrosius Aurelianus, who organizes the resistance to the Saxon invasion. He also described a great British victory at the Battle of Mons Badonicus, or Mount Badon, which is later ascribed to Arthur. Gildas then goes on to bash 5 English kings: Constantine, Aurelius Canonus, Vortiporius, Cuneglas, and Maelgwyn, as well as the clergy of his own time period. Scholars debate the dating of Gildas's writing, with some saying it was written in the late 490s and others stating it to the 540s. Either way, in Gildas we get a peek into what life was like during this tumultuous but mysterious time period in British history. Nennius is a major source for information about King Arthur. He wrote Historia Britannicum, the history of the Britons, in the 9th century, around 828 AD. The oldest surviving manuscripts of Nennius's work are from the 11th century. According to Alan Lupac, Nennius was no venerable Bede in terms of his historical accuracy, and yet, quote, not all of Nennius can be dismissed, as he apparently had access to no longer available 5th century sources, but neither can he be entirely trusted, close quote. In the Historia Britannicum, Nennius tells the tale of how King Vortigern allowed Saxons to settle in England in exchange for marrying the daughter of Hengist, a semi-legendary Jutish king who also served as Vortigern's mercenary. Nennius introduces Arthur by name in chapter 56 of his history, calling him not a king, but a dux bellorum, or a military commander. Nennius also describes 12 battles fought by Arthur in trying to rid England of the Saxons. Some early Welsh sources mention these battles as well, but there is debate among scholars as to the location of these battles, some of which may have occurred as far north as southern Scotland. It is from Nennius that we get the name Pendragon, associated with Arthur's father Uther. Pendragon is a Welsh word, pen meaning head or chief, and drag meaning dragon or warrior. The hero of our reading, Sir Gawain, features in Nennius's account, so we can see him as one of the original knights associated with Arthur. What really got the world beyond the Celtic fringes interested in the matter of Britain was Geoffrey of Monmouth, who lived between 1100 and 1155. He wrote Historia Regum Britanniae, the history of the kings of Britain, around 1136. Geoffrey explains that his history is a Latin translation of a, quote, very old Anglo-Saxon book, close quote. But no one has discovered what the book was. Geoffrey of Monmouth gives his readers the first surviving integrated chronology of Arthur's birth, reign, and death, as well as the character Merlin, Arthur's court mage. In the Historia Regum Britanniae, Arthur conquers Rome and establishes an English empire. We have no Round Table, no Sir Lancelot, no Tristan, but, as Arnie Sanders puts it, quote, this single text was the fountainhead from which all the subsequent narratives of Arthurian romance spring, with occasional infusions of new characters or matters from other traditions, close quote. The selection in your anthology from Geoffrey gives the account of Arthur's death on page 136. Was, who lived between 1100 and 1175, was a contemporary of Geoffrey of Monmouth, and his Roman de Brut offered a paraphrased version of the Historia Regum Britanniae. It is written in Old French, and Was's work also added some very iconic elements of Arthurian lore, including the Round Table, the importance of chivalry in Arthur's court, and the tradition of kingly quests, among other enhancements. You have in the assigned reading for this unit Was's take on Arthur's death. It is the English priest Layamon who translates Was, and therefore in a way Geoffrey of Monmouth, into Middle English in his poem Brut. His poem was probably composed around 1205. It is written in verse, but only uses alliteration occasionally. According to Robert Ackerman, the poem uses some deliberately old-fashioned language, and much of its vocabulary is actually Old English instead of Anglo-Norman. Some scholars have speculated that Layamon chose his vocabulary to appeal to his poor and illiterate audience in Worcestershire. Before mass media like television and film, and before a widespread print culture, the English language could have wildly different usage by region. You can still experience this today in terms of pronunciation, in the variety of English accents beyond the quote-unquote received pronunciation you hear on the BBC or from British film stars. Your anthology gives you Layamon's treatment of the death of Arthur also, so that you compare how this event was recorded in Geoffrey of Monmouth and Was, and then how Layamon treats it literarily. After the Romances, Sir Thomas Malory wrote Morte d'Arthur in the year 1485, which was at the very end of the War of Roses, compiling varying Arthurian sources into one long prose narrative about Arthur's life and death. Malory, who fought during the War of Roses in England, was familiar with battles and fighting, and thus brings a level of realism to the tale.
The anthology contains several chapters from Morte d'Arthur, centering around the affair between Lancelot and Guinevere, and the deaths of Lancelot and Arthur. These selections begin on page 536. Morte d'Arthur was also one of the texts printed by William Caxton, the first retail printer in England, whom I'll talk about in a little bit in the next lecture on this topic. I'd like to pause here in the English language line of the Matter of Britain to mention the Mabinogion, which is a group of stories first collected in the 12th and 13th centuries. These are prose stories, not poems, like Layamon's work, written in medieval Welsh. King Arthur appears in the Mabinogion, and the work also contains quest stories, like that of Coolwick and Olwen, where Coolwick is described as Arthur's cousin. By the way, there was a series of young adult books written in the 1960s, loosely based on themes and characters found in the Mabinogion, which I read at least once a year when I was a kid. It's called The Prydain Chronicles by Lloyd Alexander. The fifth book in the series, The High King, won the Newbery Medal in 1969. I'd now like to talk about the Matter of Britain in non-British languages. Mainly, I want to talk about a very, very important author known as Chrétien de Troyes, who lived between 1130 and 1190. He was a highly influential and important author writing during the 12th century. From 1160 to 1172, he resided at the court of Marie, the Countess of Champagne, a very sophisticated lady, and the daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine and her first husband, King Louis VII of France. Chrétien is the innovator in the roman, or romance, genre of medieval literature. Roman means something more akin to in the vernacular language, i.e. not Latin, instead of a romance novel like we would think of today. French romances were usually written in verse couplets or rhyming lines, which made the stories, which could be rather long, easier to remember. Chrétien wrote 5 Arthurian romances about Arthur and his knights: Clige, Erec and Enide, Yvain, also known as the Knight with a Lion, Lancelot, and Percival. It is in Chrétien's romances that we meet Lancelot for the first time, learn of his love for Arthur's queen Guinevere, and learn about the quest for the Holy Grail. Chrétien's romances inspired several other writers from various countries, Germany, Switzerland, and even Norway. There is some debate among scholars as to how much Chrétien's work influenced the Mabinogion, as there are several stories in the Welsh collection that are similar to Chrétien's romances. According to Schoaf, quote, opinion is divided as to whether the authors of these tales had read Chrétien's works, or whether the two versions came from similar older sources. It is clear at any rate that the Welsh authors were familiar with the characters independently of Chrétien, close quote. Before we move on to our specific Arthurian romance for this unit, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, we need to talk a little bit about a very important concept in Chrétien's work and others in the Middle Ages: courtly love. Courtly love was an idea that flourished in the 12th century and beyond, and is the beginning, really, of the idea of romantic love as we know it today. This does not mean that there weren't anybody falling in love before the Middle Ages, or that there was not a concept of love literature, but the ways in which the people describe love and act when they're in love were being heavily discussed during this time period. The topic was especially important to 2 very powerful and influential women, Chrétien's patroness, Marie of Champagne, and her mother, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, who later married King Henry II of England. The central idea floating around in the concept of courtly love was that love was a quasi-religion. The female object of the love was usually unattainable in some way. She may have been of higher social status than the male lover, or she may have been married, or both. During this time period, many of them were off in the Middle East on crusade, leaving their wives to run the castle and organize the retainers. Thus, one can think of courtly love in some ways as the transference of allegiance from the feudal lord to his lady. For courtly lovers, love means suffering, but it also inspires the lover to do noble deeds and undertake impossible tasks. In Chrétien's Lancelot, for example, Sir Lancelot must not only fight monsters and cross a bridge made of swords to rescue Queen Guinevere from her abductor, but he also has to suffer the humiliation of riding around in a cart, which was associated at that time period with dishonorable behavior. The people of the Middle Ages, or at least the upper class ones, took the idea of courtly love to heart. Andreas Capellanus, a cleric at Marie of Champagne's court, wrote The Art of Honest Loving, where he insisted that loving was an essential part of being a knight, along with fighting, being good at sports, playing music, and being a poet. Though his work is satirical, we can see how knighthood had evolved beyond merely battle prowess. Knights must now also be gentlemen. It's important to note how ideas of warriors are changing over this time period. For example, it's very hard to envision a character like Beowulf playing a lute and reciting poetry to King Hrothgar's wife, Wealhtheow. This is the end of part 1. I will see you for part 2 of the lecture, which is more specifically on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, in just a bit.